Hello and welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. The church is in desperate need of reform. Do you agree with that? Well, probably, because most people see, declining participation, seeing how the church has given in to political movements, particularly nationalism, how people are deconstructing from the church. So something needs to change and is in need of reform. Reform is very old in the church and has been with us since the beginning. But the question really is, which direction should we go? Rediscovering doctrines of the past, trying to recapture some idea of what the church used to be and what its doctrines used to be in the past, or reforming the doctrines that we have to in the new era, in seeing Revelation happening again. And there's a lot of disagreement about what this means. And I'm here to say that I argue that we need to do a little bit of both, but part of not recapturing a past that didn't really exist or that is a myth, but getting back to basic principles, sure, that makes a lot of sense. But what about making theology that sheds some of the harmful things that we used to have? So that's the discussion that we really ought to have. The motto of the Presbyterian Church USA is Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda, which is Latin for the church reformed, always reforming. And there's been a couple variations of this since the 1670s, when the Reformed Christians really looked up to this guy, the Dutch theologian Jodocus van Lodenstein. And the idea at the time was that the Reformation needed to be codified into confessions. This is the 17th century when we get a lot of theological confessions. I would call them theologigical innovations. Some people get uncomfortable with that because they think, oh, you're going back. But the truth is no. Is that they were there. This is the time when they were taking many of the theologies of Calvin, Luther, and other reformers, and then putting them down into doctrine, into code, and putting them into confessions. Then the term Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda, which is not the complete phrase, there's more to it, but that's the essential part, was revived by Swiss theologian Karl Barth in the early to mid 20th century, and he used the term in 1947 to, kind of hearkening back to St. Augustine and some of the earlier church fathers at the time, but saying, we've come this far, we really need to have a church that is changing and based on its principles. But that's where kind of the agreement ends, is that there is this idea of always reforming, but how to reform and really makes a big difference. Conservative Presbyterians see reform as the reexamination and then going back to doctrinal purity, and you even see that today. And what they're doing is they're confirming a long-held myth in the Reformation, that started with Luther, honestly, was this, that the Reformation was primarily about capturing a long-lost purity that the church had and that the Catholics had corrupted. It's a complicated story because you always have to ask, well, what purity, what period, what was orthodoxy? So many Protestants will say, well, we're going back to orthodoxy. I'll go, well, wait a minute, you're Protestant, you're already Reformed, you've gone through the Reformation, you've rejected orthodoxy, honestly. And then they'll go, no, there's a pure church before the corruptions of the Catholic Church in the let's go back to the church fathers, the patristic church fathers. It's complete ignorance of history. because then you go, okay, well, which church father, which one got it right? In other words, this was before the canon was established, before any of the the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed, before many of the things that came together in the 4th and 5th century. And you go, well, they had a purer Christianity then, and they were more orthodox. This is crazy. So you have to really kind of go. You always have to ask that question. If you're going back to an orthodoxy that was lost, you have to say, when was it right? When was orthodoxy really more, quote, biblical? Well, they'll say, well, no, we're going back to the 1st century. I go, what are you talking about? So anyway, that's sort of the conservative Presbyterian way of looking at it. When I say Presbyterian, I also mean all Reformed people. So even Dutch Reformed, Reformed Christian Reformed, the Reformed Christians of America, all the different denominations that, quote, call themselves Reformed. Even Baptists that use Reformed theology, for example, and you can look at that. But really, a pretty big swath of Calvinist and Lutheran Christians. Conversely, the PCUSA and most more progressive denominations, but especially those that are what we would consider mainline today, most of these people see Reform as a natural part of the ongoing revelation of the church, and that God is bringing us new understandings of the gospel. In today's environment, we have to look at it as, what are we shedding? Well, we're shedding a European-centric theology that grew up out of the Enlightenment, which had great benefits for humanity, but are really also contain a lot of Christian supremacy, white supremacy, authoritarianism that, none of us really want anymore, but we seem to hang on to this idea of a pure Christianity back then. So the way you really see this is in that almost 300-year gap in the Presbyterian Church between the Westminster Standards of 1649 to the Barmen Declaration in the mid-20th century, which was established and written in 1933, with Karl Barth, with Bonhoeffer and others who were trying to say, the confessing church really opposes Nazis. The reason why this is so important is because people like Barth saw that authoritarianism, fascism, was a natural outgrowth of the theologies that had been pushed so hard for centuries, is that once governments got the ability to control their people more thoroughly, and this is what happened with fascism in the 20th century, is that that governments, bad actors, got the ability through the use of religion and religious institutions and technology, meaning things like the mass media and radio and newspapers and propaganda, were able to control their people in ways that they never were able to before. People like Barth realized that that this is a natural outcome, and that the church needed to reform again because they needed to be able to reject the melding, the merging of political authority with religion. And it had always been there, but the means to exercise control just got worse and worse and worse. So instead of seeing fascism, especially Nazism, as an anomaly or anti-Christian, which it certainly was not, is that it is when you use religion, use Christianity to exert control. So there was clearly a need for reformation or reform in religious institutions about a century ago, and it took kind of got us, especially us Reformed people, out of our stupor to realize that the Westminster Standards were not everything. Now, that's a big division within Reformed circles, because many conservative Presbyterians and other Reformed people say, well, the Westminster Standards are what happened in the 17th century, defines Christianity, and all the stuff that happened afterwards is just doesn't really belong in our doctrinal change. We don't need to change doctrinally. But that's a problem, and you have to also see that also lifts certain confessions in that period to a level that denies the fact that these were political documents. So if you're Dutch Reformed, or if you're in that era, you look at the three forms of unity, which are the Belgic Confession, the Second Helvetic Confession, and the Canons of Dort, and you say, well, that pretty much defines Reformed Christianity. And then in 1640s, as England was slipping into civil war, that's when Parliament said, you know what, we need to have a confession that's broad enough that can include the Anglicans, that can bring in the Presbyterians, that can bring in moderate Reformed people, in order to oppose the Puritans, the more radical Calvinists, but also at the same time exclude Catholics. So even the Westminster Confession of Faith, which Reformed people, especially Presbyterians, look to as the sort of the defining document of what we would consider standard Christianity, is a political document, and it was meant to bring the Anglicans and the Presbyterians, who were mostly in Scotland, of course, under the same tent, along with the more moderate versions of the Dutch Reformed people, and as a bulwark against Catholicism, which was still a big challenge for them. It wasn't until the Glorious Revolution in 1688 when Catholicism as a national religion in the UK or in England was finally not going to happen anymore, but also that Puritanism would be pushed down too, and that the standard Christianity. So when we look at this, there's a lot of history in that, right? But we should never, ever look at these documents, the three forms of unity, Westminster Confession and catechisms, and also the London Confession that the Baptists had in 1689. We should never look at them as anything other than political documents. They are defining doctrine and locking it down so that these different strains of Protestantism could be unified politically. But we tend to today, and also for the last few hundred years since then, have kind of said, well, that's true Christianity. And we don't really need to reform. We can reinterpret that. We can say, oh, maybe there are certain aspects of these reform documents that maybe we have a better understanding biblically and so forth. But, there's no real need for true reform. This especially comes out of the fundamentalist movement in Presbyterian world in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and what they called the Five Fundamentals in 1910. that movement said, we don't really need to reform anymore. We're done. What happened with the shock of World War One, the Depression, rise of fascism, and World War II, is that most mainline churches said, "Oh my goodness," and especially the Catholic Church too, with Vatican II, said, "No, we really do need to reform." So that's the major division that you see, and I would say that you see even today, because many will say, well, no, always reforming doesn't mean doing things like including women in ministry or accepting LGBTQ people in the church and affirming them. Those are perversions of the idea of always reforming. But in the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, we had the Confession of 1967, which was a response to to Vatican II, and also response to the women's movement, to civil rights, recognizing that the old confessions by themselves were not enough, because they are they tend to, or they affirm white European male-dominated structures that needed to change. By the time we got to 1983, when the Presbyterian Church Northern and Southern came together to create the PCUSA, there was a brief statement of faith, PCUSA, which is a creedal document. They don't call it a creedal document, but it certainly looks like it, and it's in that form I just love. To me, it looks a lot like the Nicene Creed, but in a reconciling and big way. It includes men and women. It includes people of all races, and it's a wonderful document. And it's kind of a miracle that this document came out, with a church that had lots of conservatives, had lots of liberals, had lots of, Northerners and Southerners, that was trying to reach out to be a broader church that could bring in people of different, of different races and different ideas. Of course, there are many other challenges that have happened through that. It wasn't until 2016 when the PCUSA adopted the Belhar Confession, which is a very firm anti-racist document, and says that we can't discriminate against people, and that's against the nature of God, the character of God, the revelation that we have today about what it means to be church. Again, some people will really resist that, but when you look at that document, the Belhar Confession, and you compare it to, say, the idea of getting away from institutional racism and using the state to enforce religion, like the Barman was against, then you can kind of say, oh, okay, well, this is a great document, because it really gets us where the church needs to go. I don't believe that the Belhar Confession could have been brought into the PCUSA without some of the reforms that happened in 2010 and 2014, which repudiated the exclusion of LGBTQ people from leadership. And some people will say, well, this is what's wrong with the idea of reform today, because you're just adopting the culture into church. You'll often hear that. Well, I go, give me an era. Give me an era, any time in church history when the church didn't look at society as it is and say, this is wrong. This is not in the character of God. This is not what the scriptures support. this injustice that we're seeing in the society needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed in our doctrines and in our confessions. There is not a period in the church's history when that wasn't a major strain of reform, both in the Catholic Church, in the Orthodox Church, and in Protestant churches. It's just, that's the way it goes. But when I say that that 300-year gap between the Westminster Confession of Faith and Barmen was a period where the church fought mightily, the Reformed churches fought mightily over what is reform, and does reform continue or not. But in the late 19th century, there was a movement to replace the Westminster Confession that just never really got off the ground, because this is also the period of fundamentalism, the rise of fundamentalism. And fundamentalism came out of anti-abolition, came out of being firmly against the rise of science, particularly in evolution. So instead of integrating these new trends in society and in our understanding of nature and the world, and and God's creation in science, well, no, we're just going to reject it because it's, quote, opposed to the Bible, or a literal reading of the Bible, which was kind of a new thing. Things like biblical inerrancy and infallibility came out of this era. It really wasn't there in the same way before. You also had things like papal infallibility in the Catholic Church in Vatican I, and many of those reforms, is that there's this instead of it kind of they had doctrinal changes in order to resist modernism, and it happened in all kinds of religions, or in all kinds of faiths. So that's really that background of when do we reform, when does new reform, when is it needed, and how do you reform? I would say that today, most people, most religious people, most people in the church realize that some level of reform is needed, because some of the models that were happening. First of all, there's declining church attendance. There is a radical move, I consider a radical move of the church to retrench with politics, especially in the right-wing politics today. And you got to go, okay, how do we move beyond that? Well, again, this division about what reform means is coming up again. Does it mean going back to some sort of past that didn't really exist? For many, for most people today, when they say that they want the church to go into something, they're looking for a moralistic past that made sense to them. Some of these people were quite helpful and good in a lot of respects, and that would be like people like Tim Keller, for example, and his buddy David Brooks, who's also kind of a moralist. They're looking and they're saying, well, gosh, let's get back to that nuclear family established religion that I knew of in the mid 20th century. So those would be more moderate voices of what that is. But still, they're reaching back to something that doesn't exist anymore, and also includes a lot of social structures that are racist and against groups of people. There's that really shouldn't be excluded. And those are the moderate voices. Now, there are many much more hardline voices and some very reformed voices. I'm thinking people like R.C. Sproul Jr., John MacArthur, people like that, John Piper. Those people who have taken. They're basically the acolytes of New Calvinism, and this idea of going back to something that's further back. And back to the reformers. And these people are very, very resistant to any kind of changes that we have today. So, or you can say to people, are we making a new church? I'm firmly in the camp of we need to make a new church because the church is changing dramatically, whether we like it or not. In the United States, and also in Europe, we have this luxury of being able to pick and choose how we do it. But most of the world, especially in the global South, that are taking on Christianity in new and different ways, especially in Latin America, you have a lot of liberation theology, who has in sort of in the Catholic context. That's what we've seen in Pope Francis, and now we see in Pope Leo. We see sort of a recognition of the global South in Catholicism and the bringing on of seeing Jesus as more of a liberator, which is very strong in Latin America. We also have, especially in Latin America and in Africa, we have the rise of charismatic movements and much more in the way of Pentecostal expressions. So the church is changing whether we like it or not here, and we Americans like it or not. So we have a choice. Are we going to become or do more like as Europe has done over the last century or so, and that is reject religion and kind of go into more of an agnostic approach to religion, looking at it as a historical artifact, as many Europeans do. But even in Europe, you have those people who are religious tend to be pretty right-wing and tend to be more supportive of right-wing politics. You especially see this like in places like Hungary, for example, but you see it throughout Europe. So in other words, there's this division that's happening. The religious people tend to be more right-wing, and the non-religious people, who are the majority but aren't really all that organized and just see the church as a historical artifact. Are we heading to that in America? Gosh, it sure feels like it, because the religious voices are tend to be more right-wing and very much more and they're hardening in order to protect their power, particularly in the Republican Party right now. And then there's a growing, larger group that are just saying, this religion's a historical artifact. The interesting thing is that the rest of the world is not on that train. The rest of the world is gradually taking on new expressions of Christianity in different ways. So I think that nothing's inevitable, right? So what kind of reform do we want, and where are we going with that reform? It's really important to realize that these strains are there's a health in this kind of a debate. There's a health in seeing that, yes, people are spiritual, people are religious, that we can have some of what we thought of as religious liberalism in the mid 20th century, this kind of a bit more inclusive kind of Christianity, or at least attempts to that. You could say the Jesus movement had some of that. You could say the rise and of the mainline denominations, which just had a big heyday in the mid 20th century during the Cold War, and there's lots of sociological reasons for that. But people hardened into their camps after that. So I do think that need for reform is really a sense of you going back to Scripture and the foundations of what our theology, where we're coming from, understanding who the church fathers were, understanding history, understanding what the Reformation was about and what the reformers were trying to do, but not use them to harden our positions to say we must go back to some of those things. No, it's more about to understand what the historical context of the New Testament is. That's why biblical studies, in my mind, are ultra important, and genuine biblical studies of really understanding the text in its place, and that we need more of that, not less. That gives us this background to be able to say, aha, that's what they were doing in their context, in their time, and that's what doctrine and the purpose it served. Understanding that, realizing that we can't rely on that alone, that we need to seek the love of God, the character of God in today, and then how we can bring the goodness, the gospel, the good news to more people, and not use it as a weapon, but instead bringing peace and good news that the gospel should be about, rather than about this kind of hardening into camps. So that's where I see that is going. So is the church reformed and always reforming? Yes, it's always reforming, and that really is not just for people who are Reformed Christians who tend to be more Calvinist, but that also means for holiness people, and that means for Methodists. That means for Quakers who came out of the made huge changes to our country and to who we are today. We wouldn't have the abolition movement without Quakers and without holiness people and Methodists and people like that. It was the Presbyterians who were resisting abolition. It took Charles Finney had to leave the Presbyterian Church in order to become an abolitionist. We wouldn't have had the rise of women's rights in that period. We wouldn't have had public education. We wouldn't have had labor rights and all of those things. Those were being resisted by the institutional church in a lot of ways. So, when you hearken back to what evangelicalism meant in the early 19th century, we would consider those people kind of woke or, kind of progressive in their own way. And we would consider that it was the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians and the established church were the ones that were resisting them. It's almost like the tables have turned, and there's lots of reasons for this. Civil rights movement, Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, and then sort of the modern retrenchment against these things has caused the tables to flip in a way. And it's the mainline churches that tend to be more social justice oriented, trying to improve things from a holistic way. And it's the folks that are called evangelicals are the ones that are trying to retrench and trying to use the government to suppress. So you can't neatly fit people into categories because motivations and things change over time. So that's, to me, how always reforming means. Yes, it is examination, as more traditional or conservative Presbyterians would look at. It's examination of doctrine, of Scripture, and finding doctrine in it. Yes, there's a place for that. But it's also the understanding that you can't freeze theology in one era, and that there was no better era than there is today. That God's revelation is here. We must seek God's guidance, the guidance of the Holy Spirit in today, and in how we go forward. So with that, I'll say that there are lots of things that people say about the Bible, especially about doctrine that comes out of the Bible and theological understandings that are laid on top of the Bible that aren't really there, that aren't in the Bible. So we need to use the scriptures as both an understanding of what ancient people thought about these things, as our guide, as our foundation, but not to say that our particular doctrinal ideas that come out of that or our particular theologies are the only ways in which you use Scripture. And that definition of what it was in the 17th century isn't what we need to do for all time. And with that, I'll say also, thank you, and God bless you.